Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Daniel Levy, the author of Manhattan Phoenix, The Great Fire of 1835, and the Emergence of Modern New York. This is his second book, and he's reported for Time Magazine and People Magazine. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Levy.
Good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support. In keeping the show going, go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity that promotes children's literacy. Type in 25 Beaver Street to Google Maps, and you can see it's closer to the FDR than it is to the West Side Highway, and about 4 blocks or so from Battery Park. Click on the street view on Google Maps, and you can see it's one of many narrow streets lined by buildings that would be the highest in almost any other major city. There's a noodle place, a deli, a Burger King, plenty of construction there right now, and of course, plenty of people. Daniel Levy's book explores how a fire on that block, which was named something different 187 years ago, paved the way for New York to become a modern powerhouse. The fire that leveled 700 buildings started the night of December 16th, 1835. So, Daniel Levy, what would we have seen if we were on the same block on a typical day of that year?
The area would have been a lot less dense. You would have had 2-3-story buildings. This was just south of Wall Street. Actually, it was called Garden Street or Merchants Place back then. Garden Street. There was a church, the Garden Street Church. It was a Dutch Reformed church. You had lots of merchants who had businesses there. Big shipping companies would have their businesses there. There weren't many in that sort of actual area residential people, though there were homes. You had homes more to the west and the east, and of course north. But New York at this point, you have to remember, was just Manhattan. Manhattan Island, not even most of it. The populated part of the city went up to maybe about 14th Street. You had villages throughout the city. You had Greenwich Village, of course, which was a separate community. You had Harlem. You had Yorkville. You had a lot of Bloomingdale. You had a lot of places which are only remembered now by name. It was only a few 100,000 people in the city. It wasn't mostly paved, and actually some of these places, Beaver was actually just a little bit south of where the fire started, but Beaver actually used to be a canal. When the Dutch came in the early 1600s, there was lots of streams and waterways and large ponds, and they liked the idea of canals, and they actually converted some of them to canals. So Beaver Street was a canal, as was Broad Street. It was Hergraft and Prinsgraaf, which was Graaf is canal, and eventually things were quite filthy. They dumped stuff in the waters and they paved them over, and eventually you got the streets, and these streets still run.
When did the name go from Merchant Street to Beaver Street, or Merchant to Beaver?
No, it was actually not. It was all Merchant. It was Beaver.
Merchant.
Was just south of there.
Okay.
It's the streets were, after the fire, partly redone. And slightly different patterns. So this would have been in the late 1830s, where streets were really getting changed at this point.
Today, we're used to an industrialization of firefighting. It has been, you can't say the word perfect, but it has certainly been perfected over the many years since then. In this country, thankfully, firefighters endure months of training, if not years of training. There are regulations around the equipment. There are standards for response times. Trucks can get firefighters anywhere in just a matter of a few minutes. There are, of course, fire hydrants everywhere that are functioning, which is important for this story. There's unlimited water. And there are alarms, for instance, in my house that automatically call 911 if there's a fire, even if I'm not home. I don't even have to be here to start the fire response. But back then in 1835, What was the threat of fire like, and what was firefighting like?
The threat of fire was was horrible. First of all, you have to remember, you think of construction nowadays. You have stone, you have other materials which maybe hopefully won't burn. You had buildings mostly built of wood. You had homes were heated by fireplaces. You had careless smokers. You had oil lamps. There was no, in a sense, uniform fire department like we have now. It was all a volunteer fire department, which you could think of as more as a loose assembly of fraternities who the men sort of fought against each other at times. They would race to fires and to be the first one there. And they sometimes fight along the way. They might cover fire hydrants, so their competing houses couldn't get to them. They would sometimes cut.
And why did they compete? Was that to make a few bucks, or was that for glory?
No, it was all volunteer. It was all manly. It was all sort of, my firehouse is better than your firehouse. And the men also refused. They wanted to show how manly they were. They refused to, for decades later, even to use horses to pull these fire trucks. And you have to remember there was no. The pressure was built up. You basically had this thing called brakes with these long handles on each side. And you would have like 6 or 7 men on each side pumping them up and down. And it was pretty strenuous work. You could be knocked out after a minute or two, and the guys would lay off and others would join in, and they would get the stream of water going. You mentioned fire hydrants. What we think of as the New York water system was actually they decided to do earlier in that year, early 1835. The Croton system wasn't created until 1842. So you really had to rely on small reservoirs in the city, wells, and river water. So when you have the Great Fire, you actually had them snake hoses all the way down to the East River to get water.
And there were scouts, right? There were people who literally stood around watching for fires from high vantage points.
Yeah, there was somebody in the City Hall cupola, which is still there, and they would ring bells. And there wasn't any sort of electronic, even telegraph system really at this point. They would have different bells telling you which different ward or where it was. And sometimes you had people going to the wrong way. You'd have to have somebody running after them saying, no, turn around. It's the other way. Oh my God. It was crazy. You had devastating fires where hundreds of buildings sometimes. You had of course 2 great fires during the Revolutionary War. One of them burnt 500 buildings.
I do have a question about that in a second, but I want to ask, we've covered on this show numerous race riots that occurred during the 1830s around America, not necessarily in New York. There was immigration during that era. We also have covered on this show how Andrew Jackson shaped American politics during that era. Where was America in 1835, and how did New York City fit into that story?
This was the sort of the Jacksonian era, and it really was a period where you have the expansion of voting right, of suffrage, but it was really for white men. Used to have to be a property owner or else have a certain amount of cash to have the right to vote. But there were changes in New York State's constitution in the 1820s, which expanded the right to vote to anybody who was a resident for 6 months, a year, whatever the period was. And these were really, a lot of them was sort of by the bootstraps guys who, we have our rights type of thing. But at the same time, you talk about race, at the same time, while they expanded suffrage to whites, they put more restrictions on black voting. So blacks, while the whites no longer needed property qualifications or money, blacks needed about $250 to vote. And even if you had it, you oftentimes were chased away from the polls. So you would just have just a handful of blacks at this point. Also, a year before the Great Fire, you talk about race riots, there were anti-abolitionist riots in New York. This was a period called the Year of the Riots. There were riots all over the place. And there were fears that of things called amalgamation, sort of intermarriage between whites and blacks, fear of blacks taking jobs. And also you have to remember that New York was very much, in a sense, almost a southern city. It had very close ties to the southern economy because so much of the cotton that was grown came through New York and would go off to Europe, and then products from Europe, from England, would come back to New York. So there was a point at which, in this period, where New York merchants might make 40 cents on every dollar of Southern cotton.
What was politics like in New York back then? Who ran the show? And we'll answer that first. Who ran the show in New York? What was it like?
You had, up until this point, it was the growth of Tammany. You had the Democrats, you had the Whigs. You would have, unlike nowadays, of course, you would have things like election riots. We would never hear of things like that, or people fighting over the polls, or claiming that other side was stealing or not.
You'd be surprised.
You'd be surprised. You imagine that happening nowadays. You had, I think it was in the 6th Ward, which was called the Bloody 6th. People might know it through a fictionalized version called Gangs of New York, which a lot of that was sort of, you have these groups there, where I think in one election there was 10,000 more votes than there were registered voters. So you had the different parties really fighting over control of the Common Council, and of course, New York State though really looked down on Manhattan. You had much more conservative government in for the state government than the local government, and there were constant struggles which really come out, and you have more riots resulting from that just 2 decades later.
What was the skyline like? What would you have seen if you were coming in, for instance, from where Liberty Island is now, or from the southern tip of Manhattan, which is where most of New York was?
You'd see a built-up city, but as I said, it would be like 2-3 stories. It was really more in the 1840s where you started getting taller and taller construction. And of course, you soon had cast iron buildings, which was, you were able to build buildings a lot higher with a lot less structural foundation on the bottom. The tallest buildings would be church spires. And Trinity was, I think, the tallest building at one point. Trinity, still there. The building dates from 1846 by the great architect Richard Upjohn. It's on Broadway and the western end of Wall Street. You had Grace Church, was actually the previous Grace Church. Grace is now on 10th Street, was just a block away. There were other churches, and that would have been the main thing you saw.
So I was about to ask, what buildings other than those 2 buildings, or just Trinity, what buildings were there then that are still with us today?
You have St. Paul's. St. Paul's was built in 1763, John McComb building. Actually, George Washington used to go to services there. Most people forget that New York was the first capital of the United States. You have what's Castle Clinton, which is in the Battery and the southern end. It dates from just before the War of 1812. And actually, it was on a separate island because so much of downtown Manhattan is landfill. And it was actually a man-made island. They built the fort there. And of course, War of 1812 didn't come here really. It was more in Washington and elsewhere. And that eventually was connected to the mainland. City Hall, which is up further, dates from about 1804, and that's the original building. And to give you a sense of New York development, City Hall is up on Chambers Street, and when it was built in 1804, people figured no one would ever live north of City Hall, so they only faced the south, east, and west side with marble. They put cheaper sort of brownstone on the north side because they figured no one would ever go around to that side to take a look.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
I want to go back there. I've been there many
Yeah.
times. I need to go back now and look at the back of it. That's pretty darn
Yeah.
funny.
And if you go there, there's actually, we mentioned Tammany, right on the other side of it is what's called the Tammany Courthouse. And it was built by Tammany Hall, which with lots of kickbacks. Boris Tweed, who you probably all know, was one of the most corrupt politicians ever.
And he's in the
helped-
book as a
he's,
youngster, right?
he's mentioned in the book because he was a councilman back
Yeah.
then. The building was supposed to cost $250,000, and it was finally finished. The final bill was 12.7 million.
Well,
So-
you gotta give a lot of kickbacks when you build a
He
building
got a lot
like
of
that, right?
he bought a marble quarry, which happened to conveniently supply all the marble,
Right,
to it.
Right. To that point, what big fires had New York City endured? You described the Bowery Fire of 1828. It destroyed a theater, killed horses. Really sad story. What happened in 1828? What was the legacy of that incident?
With legacy, what I found fascinating at the Bowery Theater, and my book deals with lots of, I tell it through a lot of the people who were there, but I also tell it through one building, which is the Bowery Theater. It's actually 4 or 5 buildings because the Bowery Theater, like so much of New York, burned. So the first Bowery Theater was built in 1826, and it was done by a very prominent Connecticut architect who came down to New York, became one of the biggest architects in the country, Ithiel Town. But it burnt down in 1828, and it burnt down like 3-4 more times before the Civil War. Many of these were started by, they were props during a show, what have you, some gun wadding or something, which they were using in some play, caught fire and burnt. And you had buildings, and these fires would just take out lots of other things. Actually, the first Bowery fire was started nearby in a stable, but the winds blew these things, and by the time, of course, the firemen came, these things were burning like crazy. You had, of course, those 2 big fires I mentioned during the Revolution. They were suspicious fires, possibly set by American revolutionaries. There was one right after the colonials, no longer colonials. The Americans fled Lower Manhattan, and you've actually Washington up in Harlem Heights, sort of around the area of probably Columbia, sort of writing to his cousin saying, good luck, or maybe some good patriots started this. That burnt down 500 buildings. There was 2 years later, which burnt down quite a few more. You had other fires which would just take out 120 buildings at a shot. There was actually in 1835, right before the Great Fire, which I go into, there was one down which took out dozens of buildings and put lots of people out of work. This was just a constant problem. You would have fires almost all the time. Visitors were always talking about. Dickens talked about how the fact that you're constantly hearing fire bells going off.
Take us to the morning of December 16th, 1835. Freezing cold. I can almost feel the snow and the wind whipping through the skyscrapers off the river, right? If the skyscrapers had been there.
Yeah.
There had been fires the day before. What was it like that morning with people getting over the hangover of having to have had put out fires just a few hours before?
There were 2 fires right before, and the problem was that you had a reservoir further uptown, which had maybe 200,000 gallons, whatever it held, and it was pretty much depleted. And to put these fires out, the firemen were probably exhausted. This cold snap had gone on for possibly 2 weeks. It was so cold, it actually froze the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal had been started, which really helped set New York on its course to becoming the Empire State. So you had traffic which wasn't flowing. You had the rivers were frozen. It was bitterly cold out, and there wasn't much going on that night. Though, of course, New Yorkers loved the theater, and you had people in the Bowery Theater. Actually, John Wilkes Booth's father was performing, if I remember correctly, up at the Bowery that night. And you had city watch people. There weren't really a police force. New Yorkers, Americans were really sort of distrustful of state militias and police, because it's one of the reasons for the revolution. They didn't want organized armies in that sort of way, but you had city watch people whose job it were to really look for fires and also sort of check out the potter's fields, which were sort of the burial places for the poor, to make sure no one was stealing bodies. Where you had riots over that at one point. It was quite quiet, and you had these two watchmen who smelled smoke, and they came up on this fire at Comstock and Andrews, and they opened the door, and just the entire inside was aflame. It was a gas fire that got started, and as one of them says, we quickly closed the door, and the fellows manning City Hall and elsewhere quickly set off the alarm, and you actually had fire companies racing down from all over. The fire chief, James Gullick, who oversaw this loose confederation, was one of the first people down there, and they quickly set up their engines, and they tapped the hydrants. They also ran hoses down to the river, and unfortunately you had these major winds. It was freezing cold out. You had these major winds, which made fighting fires really hard. So as they're pumping the water, actually the wind is blowing this ice cold water back into their face at times. And the fire on Merchant Street quickly burst through windows, and it spread. This Merchant Street, if you think about Lower Manhattan, this was sort of near Hanover Square, which is still around. So we're talking about the eastern side, more the eastern side towards Pearl Street in that area. And you had in no time, you had 20, 30 buildings aflame. More fire companies came, and this thing just was a perfect storm of fire. You had the cold, you had freezing. It was
the
very
hoses
hot.
froze, right?
You had hoses freezing, and actually within about 2 hours or so, they had to actually stop using hoses because they became like logs. This isn't like the pressure you have nowadays. These were basically thin cloth, probably hoses, rubber hoses.
And where were they pulling the water from?
They were pulling them from the hydrants, but unfortunately the hydrants tapped into the reservoir, which was relatively depleted, and they were pulling it from the
and they actually had to pump it up. They actually had to pump the hydrants.
It would flow to the hydrants, but there was very little pressure leading to the hydrants. They would pump the engines to try to build up the stuff to get onto the fire. They started actually at one point. It was not uncommon for them to soak blankets and try to lie them on roofs and windows and what have you to try to stop it. And at that point, they're just trying to save goods.
Yeah, right. You described the first few minutes of the fire as completely chaotic. Within 15 minutes, the fire engulfed 50 buildings. What were the people of New York? How did the people of New York react to this fire starting?
Some people rushed down there. I have two of my main characters, the main diarists, who link all the different characters in the book. One of them was a fellow named Philip Hone, who was one of the great American diarists. He was mayor, actually, for 1 year. He was one of these patrician, very wealthy man. He's a friend of John Jacob Astor. His son had a business down there. He rushed down. He lived up near City Hall, so he rushed down. And the other one was a fellow, George Templeton Strong, who was actually a contemporary of Hone's sons. He went to school with one of Hone's sons. His father was a prominent lawyer, and he was maybe about 15 at the time. He had just started at Columbia, and he wrote about it. But people were rushing there, and many of them were merchants rushing there to try to save their goods. And there was frantic attempts to try to save goods, to move them quickly. And you had people rushing into their buildings, which are burning, and trying to just save things.
I don't know how many people have seen a giant fire. I have, as part of my job as a news reporter, I've seen many, many fires. I've seen the aftermath of many fires, and it's completely terrifying to see a fire that is out of control and to know that people's lives are at stake and to know that their goods are at stake. I mean, even just losing everything you have is an incredibly traumatic and awful experience. I want to read a quote that describes what this fire was like so people can get a sense of the power that we're dealing with here. The quote is, "An ocean of fire, roaring, rolling, burning waves, surging onward and upward and spreading certain universal destruction, tottering walls and falling chimneys with black smoke, hissing, crashing sounds on every side." Why did you think it was important to include that quote?
It was a contemporary quote, someone who saw it, and to give a sense of how widespread this fire. The fire eventually covered an area probably the size of what was destroyed in the World Trade Center. It went pretty much from Broad Street to the river, and from Wall Street down to Coentus Slip. It was just a vast area, and you have to remember, it was very narrow streets. It was very hard to get through. So you would sometimes have burning walls of fire on each side. There was, as I talk about, one of the merchants got up on the roof of one of the buildings to sort of see this, and it was just devastating what he saw.
What were your sources for this book? I love to ask this question because I love to hear where authors, how they cultivate their books and where they get everything from. So what papers did you go through? Was it newspaper accounts? I know you mentioned a couple of diarists. Were there maps? What research was there? What did you discover that was new? And where were all these archives and documents?
I spent quite a long time. I worked on this book for a long time. I was supposed to.
How many
finish
years?
it.
5 years? 10 years?
Well, I was supposed to finish it in 2, and it was about a dozen years. So
it's a beefy book. It's great.
Yes, and also I have a full-time job.
Yeah.
But it also I thankfully was blessed with a very patient editor who knew what I was doing, what I was trying to do. And this, of course, the fire is just a small part of the book. It's really about how the different forces within New York that were playing out at this time, things like fire and water and land and trade, what have you, really created the modern city, and how this was this one moment in time which really sort of helped spark everything that went along with it. But I spent years triangulating the fire, and I went through, as you said, diarists like Philip Owen and George Templeton Strong, letters, newspaper accounts. There were maps. James Gordon Bennett, who started the great New York Herald just that year, covered the fire. And actually, right after the fire, he went out and he did a form of reportage, which was unheard of at the time. And now, of course, it's quite common. But he walked around what became known as the Burnt District, and really, in like 4,000 something words, really wrote about what he saw, what was going on around him, of merchants weeping, of people digging through remains of their buildings. You had some people, they would stand where their building was, and they couldn't, there was not only no building there was nothing to the shoreline. They just had open vista. There were some accounts written about it after people cataloged what went on. There was 674 buildings which were destroyed in this fire. It devastated this lower part of the city. I read through lots of papers. Thankfully, some of them, there actually can get hard copies of them. You go to the New York Historical Society. Some things have not been digitized or microfilmed. I went through lots of microfilm, but also you can get these, broadsheets, bound broadsheets of things like the New York American, the New York Evening Post, of course, the Herald, and what have you. And what I love is that sort of serendipity of going through newspapers where you're looking at one thing and also your eye catches something on the other side, and you realize, oh, I can use this elsewhere.
And how was the quality of the reporting that you went through? As a reporter, you've written for Time Magazine and others, and what was it like to read their contemporary accounts, and did you find them useful and responsible?
I found the fire ones pretty useful. Other times they were not. You could really see the bias in the writing, especially when they talked about, say, race relations. You had, the abolitionist riots, which was just the year before the fire. And depending on which paper you have them talking about either the white mobs or the they were blaming the blacks. Of course, the blacks did nothing to cause all this, and they talked about how they were ready to burn down the city, which was nonsense.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
There, in politics, you especially see it because a lot of the papers had very clear political ties, and they would support their candidate, and they would, of course, always attack the other side. So you have to take lots of stuff with a grain of salt, and really sort of, sift through it to try to figure out things. But thankfully, for the fire, and there was tons of coverage, and of course, also quite a few newspapers were put out of business, as were insurance companies by this fire. But people did sort of resurrect
because they lost
business.
their offices.
Yeah, they were burnt down. They would
Yeah.
have to be relocated.
Yeah.
James Gordon Bennett was very lucky. He wasn't, and actually went to great expense. He actually ran a wood engraving actually of the Merchants Exchange, which was the grandest building at the time, the sort of the remains of it, the shell of it. And he also ran a map, and he went to great expense, but this really gave us people a sense of the fire. There was actually also a lawsuit. I went through depositions of witnesses because to stop the fire, they had to actually blow up buildings to create fire breaks. Which, they create fire breaks. You think about forest fires. They try to clear an area so the fire won't spread. They try to do the same things here with buildings. And actually, the first building was blown up by James Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton's son. He was the U.S. attorney, and he was the guy who said, "We just got to blow up these buildings," and he set up the gunpowder. But I just lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay. So the next question I had was the cause of the fire. How close were they able to get to nailing this down?
It was a gas fire. They had gas. Gas had arrived in New York the decade before or so, and it was a gas leak. It just started fire.
So eventually, the fire burns out in how long?
Well, it was finally, the main fire was put out by 6, 7 in the morning. It went for about 10 hours. So let's say 7 in the morning, but there were other fires that were starting up because things would smolder and then break out again once oxygen got in there. So for a few days they were fighting, and of course you talked about firemen being exhausted. These guys were just completely wiped out, and thankfully you had fire companies coming from Brooklyn. They would take ferries across from Newark. You even had fire companies. The fire was so pronounced. You talk about the ocean of fire, that they could see the glow in the sky in Philadelphia and New Haven. So you had fire companies that night in Philadelphia running out of their firehouses thinking, "Oh, the suburbs just north of us, there's a fire. Let's find it." And they couldn't find it because it was
in New York.
It was.
They got to jump on the turnpike, and
they got to get on the turnpike or the Garden State.
Yeah, right. The aftermath. I asked you about the morning of the 16th. Let's talk about the morning of the 17th. If you were to go out and walk through the rubble and through the wreckage, what would we have seen? Hearing about it, reading about it in your book reminded me of 9/11. $500 million in those days is a lot of money. That's how much damage there was. 17 blocks destroyed, 700 buildings. What was the aftermath? What did people wake up to?
They woke up, they felt this was the wrath of God. It was utter devastation. Buildings that were once there were no longer there. It was very hard to get through streets because you had rubble from the buildings there. You had streets were filled with destroyed merchandise. Because you remember, when the fire was going on, people were trying to save what they could, and stuff was getting damaged as they went. Because they would sometimes piled up tons of stuff and say Hanover Square, and then the fire came through and burnt everything. So you just have a mass of burnt merchandise lying around. You had weeping merchants. You had the few families that lived in that area. They might be huddling. You had lots of young men and boys who might start little fires with rich mahogany furniture to keep warm. They would sometimes throw in tea. So you had very sweet smelling Hyson tea fires and what have you. It was people really felt like this was people were rushing to churches. There was a rebuke from God because they were seen as being too worried about money and stuff.
And 2 people were killed. Who were those people?
Just 2 people. Don't really know.
Yeah.
Just a handful of people died. It was very fortunate in that way that there were no, it wasn't, of course, like the World Trade Center, which was just a few blocks away, where 2,000-3,000 people died.
Yeah. So the immediate relief effort, how did New York come together in the short term before we get to the long term and the crux of your book, which is how this paved the way for New York to succeed in future generations? What was the short term effort like to recover?
You don't have FEMA and stuff like you have nowadays. You had basically the mayor called a meeting, and 150 top merchants and citizens gathered, and they divided them up into little groups to some people to approach the federal government, some people to approach Albany, what have you. Philip Hone, my diarist, was the group that went to Albany, and they got a couple $1 million in aid. They got the federal government to hold off on payments to the Treasury. You had the Second Bank of the United States, which of course Jackson soon after destroyed. They agreed to help. You had other cities sending money. The thing was that New York was still seen as as a viable, important place, and you have rebuilding that restarted right away. One of my main characters is Arthur Tappan. Him and his brother Lewis were.
It was fun to hear some of the familiar names. Of course, we know the Tappan Zee Bridge.
Tappan Zee actually is Indian. Z is Dutch for sea, so it was the Tappan Sea because it was so wide. No, the Tappans is just coincidental.
Oh,
Tappan
funny. Okay, I'm glad I know that.
Tappan. I'm a font of useless information. The Tappan brothers were from Massachusetts, if I remember correctly. Sorry, and they made a fortune. They were multi-billionaires in today's dollars in silk trade, and they were very big in good works. They were major abolitionists fighting prostitution, temperance. They were for temperance, I should say. And his business was on Hanover Square. And actually, when the fire started, a lot of his workers rushed in to help bring out stuff, and they quickly moved part of his stock out. And also a lot of blacks who realized that the man who was really working for their rights and their freedoms was in danger of losing his business. And you had African Americans running in to help save goods. His store was, of course, completely leveled. He had moved his stuff. He actually moved it twice, because when they moved it to, I think, Beaver Street initially, that building was then threatened, and then they moved it further on. He met with his brother and his other partners the next morning, and they said, we're going to rebuild right away. His building, actually, the initial one was done by the architect who did the Bowery Theater. They got it just a builder to build a new building, and within no time, his new store was open. Others were building like crazy, and land started going for a lot of money, empty lots. The Dutch Reformed Church I mentioned went for $200,000-$300,000, which was an unheard of amount of money for an empty lot of land, and people started building right away. There was also a move to try to widen, straighten out the streets. There was some of it. There wasn't much. It wasn't. If you think about New York, you think of New York as a grid. The New York grid really starts on Houston Street, which is a mile or so north of here, and that was all started in 1811. So the plan in New York was really the ultimate real estate boomtown, was really started north of here. And of course, as merchants started rebuilding, but then also moving north, you then have the massive development of land, which took off at this point, which was one of the great forces.
Yeah. So explain how this fire starts to pave the way, not only for the geography of New York to change, but for its economy to change, for its politics to change, and for its people to change.
The fire was, as I said, one of the catalysts for the growth. you have, as I said earlier that year, they decided to build a reservoir, and this really, or an aqueduct system, I should say, and a reservoir, which really, the fire really pushed them along, saying, we really have to do this. And they really started work on it just the year after the fire. And they actually built an aqueduct, which came from the Croton. They built from the Croton River, they built an aqueduct, a reservoir up there, and a 40-mile long aqueduct, which revolutionized New York because it gave a proper water system, which of course helped with fighting fires. You still had the independent firehouses, but they had much more water all of a sudden. And you had merchants who, the city was growing, had been growing with the Erie Canal, which got started 10 years earlier, and money coming in. And even though you have right after the fire, there was a major depression, the Panic of 1837, which really slowed everything across the country. Once that was over, within 7 years or so, things really started to explode. And you have hotels being built. The year after the fire, John Jacob Astor, who lived next to Philip Hone, just up Broadway, built the Astor House Hotel, which was one of the first really great hotels, and others saw the money that could be made in housing visitors.
So was the fire a psychological change, a kick in the butt to get things moving, a motivation, or was it did it set off practical changes in what the city was forced to become?
It did all of them, and it did all of those, and some of them took, of course, longer than possible. There were complaints about the fire department, which came. The firemen were, of course, initially seen as heroes, but people started to blame them really soon after. Gulick, the fire chief, was fired the following May, and there were constant calls for reform of the fire department, and of course, it took another 30 years. But with the sort of modern municipal non-volunteer fire department started. There were slow calls for building construction changes. How buildings, like buildings next to each other be party walls versus, say, a uniform sort of wall. There were just lots of changes.
Why was the Civil War a bookend for your book? Why did you find that a good place to kind of say, okay, this is where this big transformation has kind of taken the city from the Jacksonian era into a new era? And then, of course, you saw great division during the Civil War. But why did you find that to be the right bookend for you?
I actually initially, talk about changes in book, initially was going to go up to just the opening of Central Park, which was just a year or so before the Civil War. But there were all these forces which were really sort of playing out, and I really had to talk about. And of course, you have Central Park, one of the major members of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. If you think of the modern day Red Cross, this was a group which was really bringing medical aid to soldiers during the Civil War. One of the main people in that was Frederick Law Olmsted, who, of course, built the park, and it was organizational quality. New York, so what I liked sort of not visually, but sort of that sense of New York going from really fire to rebirth. So you have this devastating fire and other devastating fires which lead through this period. And then you have this flowering of New York and the changes that happened, because at this point, talking about parks, when the street pattern was laid out just before the fire in 1811, 20 years earlier, there were very few parks planned for New York. And as the city was really just economically booming and the streets were being laid out, you have during this period, the northern part of New York, from 14th Street, within 30 years, you have buildings up to the 60s. So you have buildings going up miles from where the fire was, and from 14th Street. And there was a sense of New York that they were just too much building was going on, too much development was going on. We had to, of course, try to save the city. And they, of course, some visionaries decided we're going to build a park in the middle of the city. And the park, in a way, stopped development in that area, but also increased development along the sides. and really made New York a very different city than what it had been. There were other forces. You have, leading up to the Civil War, of course, you have the fight over slavery, the abolitionist fight with people like Tappan and others. And this was really the beginning of a period where people were really saying we have to, we have to do something about slavery. Of course, you think about slavery, there was slavery in New York until 1827. People don't really realize that. And even when slavery ended, blacks were really sort of second, third class citizens.
What would a proper monument or memorial to the fire look like if you could design one?
I never thought about that. I would like to see some area, maybe reconstruction of what was there before. They're not going to give a block or so.
Yeah, right.
But something like the Merchants Exchange. I wouldn't want a devastation fire. Some sort of ghost memorial in a way. There's a wonderful building in Philadelphia by the great architect Robert Venturi, Pritzker winner, which is a silhouette of Benjamin Franklin's old house business. And it's really just, think of a quick sketch of a house with no windows or anything. And it's you can kind of walk through it in the sense that this was once here. And this once took up this space. And this was once and still is important.
The artwork of fire, when you look at the paintings of different fires, is it propaganda or is it evocative? Is it accurate?
It's people were trying to memorialize what happened right away. There was a painter who thankfully did these beautiful gouaches of the fire, different views of the fire from Brooklyn Heights, and then of the fire raging from elsewhere, say down in the harbor, along with street scenes. And people were really interested in a certain way. I remember I watched the World Trade Center as it burned, and
how close were you?
I was had gotten on the train. We had just moved to New Jersey, and the trains were stopped in Newark. And when we got on the train, people started saying somebody just flew a plane into the Trade Center. And I actually took out, being the journalist I am, I actually took out my laptop, and I just started writing what was going on around me, about the people, about what they were talking about. And it was this gorgeous day. And we got out at Broad Street, and you could see the two towers in the distance with this, miles long plume of smoke. And I had just had lunch, I think the day before, with a childhood friend who had actually was best man at his wedding. And he worked on the 77th floor. He survived, thankfully. He walked down and made it across to the South Street before the buildings fell. But they said no one's obviously going into the city, and they pulled another train to go back west. And as the train was pulling out, I looked out the back window, and I could just start to see the first building crumbling and going down. And then, but of course, then, I worked in the city. I worked used to be up at Rockefeller Center, and I remember going down to the Trade Center and just all the people around. And the thing that struck me heartrending the most was the little posters were put up. Have you seen this person last seen on, the 6th floor or 73rd floor, what have you? Please, please, please call. And I remember walking around the site and just that sense of just devastation, the dust, the sort of white dust, charred dust.
I was there about a month later, and I'd never smelled anything like that before. The pile at that point was still very high, almost, maybe 50, felt like it was 15 stories when you looked up at the pile of rubble. That's certainly hard memories. The Bronx is burning. 9/11 fires in 1776, 1845. There were riots during the Civil War. There was the shirtwaist factory fire. Why do you think it is that fires in New York seem to mark turning points?
Oftentimes they're larger. more devastating. You mentioned the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. That fire brought in changes for, if I remember correctly, for building construction. Because basically the owners, they chained the doors shut, so the workers couldn't go out for breaks and stuff. And these women were stuck inside the building. The building is still there. I don't know if people know that it's the Brown Building, unless they renamed it. I used to have classes when I was a student at NYU in this building. But there were changes to how they built things, and also even how people lived. There was the General Slocum fire, which was a paddle wheel boat that would take people, on trips and what have you. And you had large German community in New York on the east side, and a lot of them were going up for a picnic, and the boat caught fire, and lots of people perished. And it was soon after that, I think, that the German community started to move further north and elsewhere.
But do you think that fires and major disasters like the ones I described are a psychological shift, that this unstoppable city suddenly meets something bigger than it can control?
The unstoppable city kept on going. The unstoppable city. If you think about September 11th, it was utterly devastating. But we're going to rebuild right away, and they built, the new Freedom Tower. You have this fire that destroys 674 buildings, and people just keep saying, "We're not going to be stopped. We're not going to be, defeated."
I know this took you a dozen years. May I ask what's next for you? Have you decided on another book yet, or are you just going to focus on your journalism?
They keep me quite busy at what's now Meredith, which used to be, of course, Time Life Books.
So are you writing for Time Magazine? Is that what it is?
Well, no, I left. I just before the Trade Center, I moved to our sister publication, People Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
So I just switched floors. And then in 2013, I went over to Time Life Books, and I'm still there, but the company has been sold twice, first to Meredith and then to Meredith, but I still write life books. I work on some of the Time Life books. I work on the Entertainment Weekly books, People Magazine books, or especially the really special issues, I should say.
Yeah. So what's next? Have you decided on another book yet, or no? If I may ask. My
wife would like me to take some time off. I'll just say that.
A marriage sabbatical.
Yes. She has been. I'm blessed with a very patient and wife who, before this, I did a book. I spent 5 years on a book on a English adventure in China, and it seemed as if we had this, Jewish Chinese general who had taken, a room in our house, and she was glad he finally moved out, and she's glad the fire has moved out.
All right. Daniel Levy, the author of Manhattan Phoenix, The Great Fire of 1835 and the Emergence of Modern New York. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Check out the book, which is from Oxford University Press. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We'll donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.